In this video, we'll be looking at some of the earliest sets in the game, more specifically Legacy of Darkness and Labyrinth of Nightmare, and going over the 10 worst cards from these early parts of Yu-Gi-Oh! And at number 10, we have Double Snare. This is a spell card which simply has the effect where you can destroy one face-up card in the field which has an effect that negates trap card effects. So it's an incredibly specific counter to a specific type of card, although it was pretty obviously targeted at Yugioh, which is a 2400 attack level 6 monster that has a passive effect to negate all trap effects. And later on it could be used on Royal Decree since it works on any face-up card that negates trap effects and not just monsters. However, funny enough, this card cannot be used on Trap Master because that card does not have an effect which negates trap effects and simply has an effect to destroy trap cards. Now, as far as incredibly specific counter cards go, it at least is usable on more targets than something like Griffin Wing, which was designed only to counter a specific card in the game. However, when this card came out, the game already had cards like Raigeki, Dark Hole, and Fissure, which could do the same job without being incredibly specific on their targets. And there was even Torrential Tribute and Bottomless Trap Hole, which were released in these two sets, which are also just better ways of destroying monster cards, although granted those two do not work on a card like Yugioh. Now, Yugioh did see a lot of competitive play, so chances are if you used Double Snare, you might have actually been able to resolve the effect, which is why it's only at the number 10 spot on this list. And at number 9, we have Cyclone Laser. This is an equip spell card which can only be equipped to a specific monster named Gradius, and it has the effect to increase its attack by 300 and granted piercing battle damage. Now, piercing battle damage at this time was kind of rare, but not unheard of, because these sets also released a card called Air Knight Parshath, which is a level 5 monster with 1900 attack, which both has piercing battle damage and allows you to draw a card if it inflicted battle damage. It was actually pretty heavily played as a staple card because it allowed you to gain immediate advantage if you successfully resolve the effect a single time, which was useful against popular staple cards like Spirit Reaper. So why wasn't Cyclone Laser good? Well, equip spell cards inherently are not very good, because they're incredibly vulnerable to all types of removal, because if the monster it's equipped to is removed from the field or simply flipped face down, then the card is sent to the graveyard, in addition to being vulnerable to spell card removal as well. And it was an incredibly specific target, which heavily limits the usefulness of the card, where they better be super good if they're going to be only usable on a single card. And Gradius is not incredibly good. It's a level 4 vanilla monster with only 1200 attack, when these two sets included a monster like Gemini Elf, which was a 1900 attack level 4 monster. So only boosting its attack up to 1500 and granting piercing damage was not really good, and would need to do a lot more than that in order to see any kind of competitive play. Especially since the sets also released powerful equip spell cards like United We Stand and Mage Power, which provide massive attack boost to any monster you equip them to, and not just incredibly specific low attack vanilla monsters. And at number 8, we have Feng Sheng Mirror. This is a spell card which has the effect where you get to look at your opponent's hand, and if they have a spirit monster in their hand, you can discard that monster to the graveyard. So if your opponent does not have a spirit monster in their hand, the card will only just let you look at your opponent's hand. Now, if you're able to resolve the effect correctly, it's not a half bad effect. The problem is that people don't really play spirit monsters, and they weren't very heavily played when this card first came out either, despite the fact it did come out in the same set as Yatagarasu, which was one of the longest banned cards in the game. Although part of the reason Yatagarasu was banned was because of a combo that would search it out of the deck anyway, and then use it in a way where a card like Feng Sheng Mirror wouldn't be able to counter it. And there were other spirit monsters that did see competitive play over the years, but only very niche amounts of it, and nowhere near enough where you'd want to run a specific counter card like Feng Sheng Mirror. So, it's never really seen any play, and probably won't unless there's some kind of really good Broken Spirit Monster support released in the future, or even then you'd probably better off just running a common staple over this incredibly specific counter card. Although it does at least have a positive effect, even if it's not a very powerful effect, which cannot really be said for a lot of the higher cards on this list. And at number 7, we have Jam Breeding Machine. This is a continuous spell card that while it's on the field, it basically floodgates the player who's using it, as it prevents you from summoning any monsters except for slime tokens. And then the card itself will summon a slime token, but only during your standby phase, and only one of them per turn. Although the effect is not a hard once per turn. So if you have 3 copies of Jam Breeding Machine, you'll be able to summon 3 tokens every turn. So here's the problem with this card. The beneficial effect does not take place until your next turn, since it's almost impossible to activate this card before your standby phase to gain immediate benefits. So you can avoid the negative detriments by just using this card during your main phase too, and after you've already summoned monsters for the turn, but then you're still kind of stuck with a card that's floodgating you. If you can give your opponent Jam Breeding Machine and force them to activate it, that's actually beneficial, which is not a good selling point of a card that you're trying to use on your own. The restrictions of locking you out of all summons just kind of defeats the purpose of summoning the tokens in the first place. And if you go the route of just removing Jam Brooding Machine from the field with something like Emergency Provisions, it's also not really worth it, because it only summons a single token per turn. So under best case scenarios of trying to take advantage of this card, and you use it last at the end of your main phase 2, get 1 token during your standby phase, and then send it to the graveyard with Emergency Provisions in order to end the floodgate on yourself and gain 1000 life points, it's basically a 2-card combo that gets you a level 1 token monster on the field, which is not worth the -1 in card advantage. However, if you instead try to stall out for as many turns as possible and gradually accumulate a lot of tokens, then use Emergency Provisions in order to send it to the graveyard later, that's really the only way to gain value from the card, as you need to get at least 2 tokens on the field to be able to pay for the cost of using Emergency Provisions and sending Jam Brooding Machine to the graveyard, which would require you to stall out for 2 whole turns. And protect your incredibly vulnerable tokens. Now, one of the benefits of the tokens summoned is that they don't have any restrictions on them, like say a Scapegoat token does. But that's about as far as the benefits go on the card. And you really have to go out of your way to make this card work for you, as it's not really good out of the gate. And it's not really worth the effort of going through the hoops in order to get the card to work for you, unless you really want to play a gimmicky Wetlands beatdown deck. And at number 6, we have Nuvia The Wicked. This is a level 4 monster with 2000 attack, which has the effect where it destroys itself on its normal summon. And with only 800 defense, it's not likely to survive being set on the field first and then flip face up. However, if it does manage to survive this convoluted summoning method, then it has another negative effect where it loses 200 attack for each monster your opponent controls. So, if your opponent has a single monster, it goes down to 1800 attack. In this same set, which had Nuvia the Wicked, Gemini Elf was also released, which was a no strings attached 1900 attack beatstick, so it could attack over Nuvia the Wicked with its negative effect being applied. I'm not really sure why this card had 2 negative effects applied to it, when either one of them was enough in order to balance the card next to a vanilla monster like Gemini Elf. And at number 5, we have Jam Defender. This is a continuous trap card which has the effect where if your opponent declares an attack, you can redirect the attack to one of your Revival Jams instead. Revival Jam is a 1500 attack monster, which has the effect that if it's destroyed by battle, you can pay 1000 life points to special summon it in defense position during the next standby phase. So the synergy between these 2 cards is pretty apparent. The card can bring itself back if it's destroyed, and you can use Jam Defender in order to protect your other monsters from at least 1 attack. The problem though is that Revival Jam comes back a little bit too late in order for it to be super useful, as you don't get the card back until your next turn. And it only comes back once it's destroyed by battle, so any other kind of removal will render it completely unusable. Which means Jam Defender itself would be completely useless if Revival Jam is not on the field, which is the main problem of the card. It's an incredibly specific card, like Cyclone Laser, which only works on one specific monster, and the monster it works on is not easy to search out or very easy to use. If Revival Jam could come back during the battle phase, it might be useful as a way to stall out your opponent's attacks. But since it doesn't come back until your next turn, it at best stops 1 attack, and there are much better battle traps to play in the game that are not incredibly specific. And at number 4, we have Return of the Doomed. This is a spell card which has the effect where you can discard a monster card from your hand in order to return a monster from your graveyard to your hand that was destroyed as a result of battle this turn. Now, the main problem with this card is the fact that it's a normal spell card, so it can only be activated during your turn. And generally, you don't enter the battle phase under the notion that you're wanting your monsters to get destroyed by battle this turn. This kind of effect is much more useful during your opponent's turn if you really wanted to return one of those cards to your hand, which is probably not worth it because of the inherent cost of the card as well. It's a -1 in card advantage because you have to discard a monster specifically, and the activation requirement for it is only a card that you've gotten on the field in the first place and managed to get destroyed by battle, of which there are not too many cards that fit the distinction that you really want to get back to your hand at a -1 cost, when you can instead just bring out the monster from the graveyard with something like Monster Reborn or Call the Haunted, which did a much better job of getting cards back to your graveyard without making you go -1 in card advantage. Really, it's that -1 in card advantage that really sets this card as kind of bad, because of just how important card advantage is in Yu-Gi-Oh! If this card could be used without having to discard, it still wouldn't be very useful, but it wouldn't be on this list most likely, as there's even a similar card called the Warrior Returning Alive, which was released in the same set as Return of the Doom, and only saw a very niche amount of competitive play over the years. And that's mainly because it didn't require any costs, even if it was restricted to only warrior-type monsters. And at number 3, we have Fairy Guardian. This is a monster which has the effect where you contribute in order to return a spell card from your graveyard to the bottom of your deck, as long as it was sent to the graveyard this turn by your opponent. So, at least Return of the Doomed allowed you to recur the advantage directly to your hand. Fairy Guardian kind of has the same problem of going -1 for the effect, but it's not even a useful effect. If you could just return any spell card from your graveyard to the bottom of the deck with its effect without any other kind of conditions, it would still be bad. The fact that it requires a target that was sent to the graveyard by your opponent makes it laughably bad. It's basically a vanilla monster with how useless that effect is, and it doesn't even have good stats with 1000 attack and defense on a level 3 monster. Now, there are 3 other cards which were created in the same vein and released in the sets, but at least those ones had better stats. The Forgiving Maiden can tribute itself in order to return a monster destroyed by battle to your hand, similar to Return of the Doom, but it at least had 2000 defense, which was a useful stat line for a level 4 or lower monster. Lady Panther can tribute itself in order to return a destroyed monster by battle to the top of your deck, and Crimson Sentry can tribute itself to return a monster destroyed by battle to the bottom of your deck, and both of these cards were equally terrible, as they didn't even return the card to your hand like the Forgiving Maiden did, nor did they have noteworthy stats. Although even they are better than Fairy Guardian, because activating the effects is actually more likely to happen, because the trigger of a monster being destroyed by battle is much easier to set up and see in a common game than the trigger of your opponent sending one of your spell cards to the graveyard during your turn. Because to make matters worse, all of these effects are spell speed 1 and thus only usable during your turn. So, how could anything be worse than Fairy Guardian? Well, at least it can be used as a vanilla beatstick, without losing you a whole bunch of advantage. And at number 2, we have a dual spot with Super Robolady and Super Roboyarou. These are 2 level 6 fusion monsters with only 1200 attack, and they both have the effect where they can return themselves from the field to the extra deck in order to special summon the other one from the extra deck, but not on the same turn that they were special summoned to the field. And then they both have different kinds of effects when attacking, where Super Robolady gains 1000 attack if it's attacking directly, and Super Roboyarou gains 1000 attack if it's battling a monster. And of those 2 effects, Super Roboyarou does have a more useful one, because it means it can actually beat over something like a Gemini Elf. Now, what's bad about these cards is that they're early game fusion monsters and have 2 incredibly weak vanilla monsters as their materials. And also, when they were released, there wasn't really fusion support to help get these cards in your hand in order to actually perform the fusion summons in the first place. You basically had to rely on hard drawing the 2 materials and a polymerization, and going -2 in card advantage in order to bring out one of the 2 fusion monsters. And for going -2 in order to bring out one of these 2 cards, they definitely did not do enough on the field to really justify the amount of investment required to bring them out. Although, to be fair, neither did most of the early game fusions. And also, their ability to tag out with each other was not even good because you couldn't actually do it until your next turn, and it was a spell speed 1 effect. So they were both level 6 fusion monsters that were technically targets for Fusion Weapon, which I know some people in the comments might mention as a benefit of it, which would provide a 1500 attack boost. Although that card wasn't released until a year later, and wasn't a better attack boost than just United We Stand or Mage Power, which was available at their release. They could also be brought out with Power Bond to double their attack since they're machine-type fusion monsters, but that doesn't really solve the problem of them still not having the consistency tools needed in order to pull that off without going -2 in card advantage. However, 5 years after they were released, they did introduce a specific support card for them called Cybernetic Zone, which on a quick play spell card, allowed you to banish a machine-type fusion monster until the end of the turn, and when it returned to the field it had its attack doubled, but then it was destroyed during the next standby phase. And since these 2 cards could tag out with each other, you could use Cybernetic Zone to protect them during your opponent's turn, get a 2400 attack monster with their benefits during your turn, and then tag it out during the main phase 2 in order to prevent them from being destroyed. And even this combo was not worth the effort, but at least there was a useful application of their ability to tag out with each other now. And at least they could somewhat be useful, despite the massive amount of card disadvantage you incurred. And at number 1, we have Chosen One. This is a spell card which requires you to select 3 cards in your hand, 1 monster and 2 non-monster cards, then your opponent randomly chooses one of the 3 cards. If the chosen card is a monster card, it's special summoned and you send the other 2 cards to the graveyard. If it's not the monster, you instead send all the cards to the graveyard. So basically, you have a chance to go -3 in order to special summon a monster from your hand. Or you have a 2/3 chance of going -4 for no effect. If this card could just special summon that monster from your hand with the same cost, without the random chance, it would still be terrible. The fact that you have a less than 50% chance of actually being able to summon the monster just makes it that much worse. In fact, this card is so bad, it's probably one of the worst cards ever made, which probably wasn't specifically designed to be bad, like Cold Feet or Jar of Generosity. It's really saying something when a card is worse than Cold Feet. a card that was made as a joke in order to lampoon a banned card, where the easiest way to affix Chosen One would be to simply make it so you don't discard the 2 non-monster cards when you use the effect, or discard any of the cards ever. If its ability lets you special summon the monster from your hand if it was chosen, and then leave the other 2 cards in your hand, it would be a perfectly average mediocre gamble card. And on a failure state, if it just lets you keep all the cards in your hand, it would still be an average mediocre card. The fact that you lose all of the card advantage in either scenario is what easily makes this one of the worst cards on this list. It would probably be in the top 10 of just worst cards of all time as well. Alright, and that's the list. If you have any suggestions for cards that should have been on this list, or have ideas for future videos similar to this one, feel free to leave those down in the comments below.